Let's talk Russia. Again, you've got that red hash where the Russians plan to stop. The red is natural gas pipelines, and the green is oil pipelines. Now, oil and agriculture are expressly not covered in the sanctions that have put on Russia to date. But insurers are refusing to cover ships operating in the northern half of the Black Sea, and ship captains are refusing to dock at St. Petersburg. So we have a de facto global sanction on Russian agricultural exports already. Now, Russian ports are not sufficiently deep to take full ocean-going tankers or cargo vessels. It's relatively small the size of vessels that can dock. So even if ship captains and insurers allowed it, and even if the sanctions don't cover these sectors in the future, they will still need to reload somewhere else. So the degree that things have to go perfectly right for Russian agriculture to continue to play a global role just is not going to happen this year. The general outrage is so high, and the insurers are so hostile to the very concept of picking up or even sailing into Russian ports that you should count on most Russian output being locked up. Now, that might loosen in a few places, but you should now count on that being the norm. About the only single spot where there may be an exception is Turkey could use its navy to escort vessels in and out of the Russian Black Sea ports and offer sovereign indemnification insurance for the vessels in order to supply itself and maybe a handful of countries in the Middle East that it would like to influence. But that is really the only player here that has the interest and the capability to do anything. Everything else is going to be locked down. Any other exports from Russia must be by rail, and the Russian rail system is already maxed out. So any sort of increases are going to be very incremental. In addition to all those problems, the Russians have another one. All these pipelines, they're all going to get shut down or blown up. And all of the exports that used to go out are going to back up in the pipeline system until you reach the wellheads, and the Russians are going to have to shut production down. And a quirk of the Russian geography, whether it's weather or the permafrost, suggests that that production will be offline for a minimum of several years, if not permanently. We've seen this before. We saw this in the collapse of the Soviet system, where they had a lot more petroleum engineers in order to shut things down safely. That is not the case today. Most foreigners are out already, and the Russians are going to have to do them themselves, and they have proven time and time again that technically they do not have the skill set to do this well. So all in all, we're talking about roughly 4 million barrels of crude daily falling offline within the next 2 to 3 months. You should consider that it's going to be offline permanently. And that 4 million barrels per day is actually not as bad as it sounds, because Russia is also the world's second largest exporter of refined oil products. It exports about 2.5, 3 million barrels per day based on who's doing the math. Almost all of that comes from the ports that are already effectively shut down. So Russia will probably fill up all of its storage for crude and for refined oil products this month. And very soon thereafter, they're going to have to shut everything down. Now, high energy prices obviously means higher diesel and bunker fuel prices, which means higher agricultural prices, and that's before you get into fertilizer, which we will get to later in this presentation. But Russian exports are now functionally limited to rail, and even within that, functionally limited to their existing pre-war rail customers. They do not have the rolling stock. They do not have the capacity to add more customers above what they're already doing for rail. The system is rickety. It's not sufficiently maintained. It frequently browns and blacks out. Again, Turkey is probably the only exception to that.
Russia is the world's largest source of fertilizer and the components that are necessary to make fertilizer, specifically 40% of potash. Russia is the world's second largest energy exporter in terms of oil, number one with natural gas, which is not just used for fuel, especially in Germany. It is used as an industrial input. It's the base of German heavy industry. It is arguably one of the top 3 items that the Germans have in terms of making their industry globally competitive. And so if something happens to that, you're talking about a loss of the world's 3rd largest manufacturing base. The energy that the Russians export in oil form, that's about 5 to 8% based on who's doing the math in terms of global energy supply. And oil supply and demand mechanics are inelastic. So if you take off 5% of global energy, you can count on prices roughly doubling. There's no way we can have globally available fossil fuels without the Russians as part of the system. On the flip side, they are also major players in things like platinum and palladium and lithium and rhodium and nickel and copper. You also can't have the green transition without the Russians. So the Russians and Germans, time and time again, generation on generation, have had this weird dance where they have to be each other's largest economic partner, but they are also each other's largest strategic rival. So they move together to try to avoid a war. A conflict happens anyway. They hive apart. There's economic dislocation as a result, which the rest of the world knows as a recession or depression, and then they repeat it. They've been doing this for centuries, and this is probably the last time they do it, in my opinion, because of demographic restrictions. So who, quote, wins, unquote, this time around really matters. I think it's its own variable, but demographics are perfectly capable of killing it all by itself. Either of these issues, from my point of view, are death blows, and having them both in roughly the same time frame is just really bad luck. I'd like to go back to something that Ian said about the Russians. I am not convinced that they're going to turn Nord Stream back on or not. I don't know. That's an internal Russian political move that it's entirely possible they haven't made the decision on. I am far more convinced that even if you put Nord Stream to the side for the moment, all of the pipes that traverse Belarus and Ukraine are ones that are probably not long for this world. It's difficult for me to see a Ukraine that believes it's losing the war to allow those to continue to operate. And I think one way or another, we're going to be seeing Russian energy fall off the market for a significant period of time.
Can't disagree on that one.
And by significant, I mean decades. The last time the Russians, for whatever reason, had to shut in their oil, it was 1992, because their exports, their raw production was fine, but their internal market collapsed, so industrial demand went away. And that meant you had wells shut in the permafrost. And when that happened, the wells become damaged, and you get frost and water expansion damage up and down the pipes and in the wellheads themselves, and eventually you have to rebuild most of the system. That took them 30 years last time. So Nord Stream is like the issue of the moment, like literally right now, this moment. But there is a half a dozen other things that are semi-related behind the scenes that are perfectly capable of making any German hope for getting back to some sort of old normal or transitioning to a new normal on a time frame they can't control. And in that sort of environment, I am very concerned about what happens with German manufacturing, and I'm even more concerned about what that means for Germany's position within the Western world. Because it feels to me like the Russians are presenting the Germans with a simple choice. We can keep the lights on for you, but that means you're out of the coalition that is supporting Ukraine, and that means the logistics that you have that is supporting Ukraine are no longer in play. Or you can do this without us, and good luck with that.